For all those who appreciate the work that we're doing here on Standing for Truth, please hit that subscribe button because we are just getting started.
I'm a biologist and geneticist by training. I did my undergraduate in molecular biology and bioinformatics, which is a mouthful just meaning the analysis of genetic sequences with computers. There's so much of it these days, you can't analyze it without a computer. I did my PhD at Harvard in cell and developmental biology, working on another Bible science tension issue, stem cells. I worked only with adult stem cells. And as soon as I graduated, joined the Institute for Creation Research, where I worked for 6 years on really the genetics of the origin of species, with a heavy emphasis on human origins. And I've been at Answers in Genesis now for 2 years, continuing that research. I've published a number of papers, and I'll be releasing a book this fall that summarizes a lot of it for a skeptical audience. The title of the book is Replacing Darwin, The New Origin of Species. And I think of it this way. The organization I work for, Answers in Genesis, is really designed to give answers to homeschool mom or grandparents. How do I answer my children's questions that they're hearing in school? Whereas this book is designed to raise questions in the minds of someone who is unfamiliar with creation, accepts evolution, and then once I've raised those questions, answer them with, I think, what is science that fits what the Bible says and actually is stronger scientifically than what evolution has taught. I had to tell you one more thing, if I may, unless you had another question. But this language is really the motivation. I started about maybe about a year ago. I found a linguist with Wycliffe. I said, hey, Babel is basically a linguistic event. It will have genetic consequences, but the cause is God confusing the languages. And really it was trying to, so I said, can we synthesize linguistics and genetics to create a comprehensive map of humanity? And really what arose out of this was the third explanation we already discussed, conquest and migration. And so here I have just printed off from the internet some of the language families to which Bodhi was referring. The Afro-Asiatic, when I saw this is what it really began to click for me. You've got a map here. Unfortunately, the colors are a little bit changed, but in blue here is Afro-Asiatic, and extends to the Middle East, of course. I said, that looks like the Islamic Empire. You've got another language family up here. The colors are a little bit split, gray and green here, but Genghis Khan's empire. I'm like, wait a minute. This is events I learned in high school that seem to be reflected in this map of humanity that, this is what the secularists are putting out. And again, the same thing holds true here in genetics. There's a little difference, of course, we learned. Take the African Americans as an example. You can change your language. You come from Africa and you learn English, but you can't change your genetics. The African Americans are still on the African branch of the family tree because that's where they came from. So in both cases we're seeing now, and this is an active research project, linguistics, genetics, these look like they're records of post-Babel extra-biblical history that the secularists, of course, cannot dispute. So this is, I think, going to be is becoming and will become a real challenge for that millions of years time scale when, in fact, everything we've seen the last few thousand years is sufficient, and it leaves an echo, a signature, a stamp in these two fields that no one can dispute.
And you're also working with scientists, creation scientists, who are dealing with the issue of supposed similarities between humans and chimpanzees, that they're so close and so on. Just summarize what they found there.
Yes, and what's interesting is even if you say, forget all the research we've done, and Jeff Tompkins has done some fantastic research, but of course, well, it's a creationist, who cares? I'll say, fine, I'll let you have that, because if you read your own literature, you will find a problem. So if you read the human, our billions of DNA letters were sequenced 2001, chimpanzee followed 2005, and those two papers are the big point of contention. In that paper, and let me just pull it up right here, because I have it. I can Google it real fast, pull my computer up, just so people can see it in the paper itself. They'll talk about 1% difference. That's often the number that's thrown around. There's a 1% difference. We're 98 to 99% genetically identical to chimpanzee. Yeah. So you hear that number, and emotionally that sounds like, well, we're just kissing cousins. How can that be possible? So let me, password protected.
So what are some of the other questions coming up, Maria?
So what are the mechanisms for mitochondrial DNA mutations, and what makes an assumption of constant rates valid?
That's a great question. And so there's two parts of the question. The second part was the constant rate assumption. What was the first part again?
What are the mechanisms for mitochondrial DNA mutations?
Okay, and the mechanism of mutation, I would say, is a black box in general for whether it's mitochondrial or some other genetic compartment. It appears to be perhaps environmentally affected. Otherwise, it just seems to be the molecular machines that are doing the copying, reading the DNA, making another copy for the next generation, occasionally make mistakes. We have an error repair system, which is remarkable. There are actual machines that go in and spot mistakes, repair them, fix them. But you've got 3 billion letters, for example, in our total DNA. Mitochondrial DNA is about 16, 17,000. And it's also the site of heavy chemical activity. And so that's in particular for mitochondrial DNA because there's so much chemical reactions going on there, reactive oxygen species and so forth. These are some of the ideas, the chemical explanations for why mistakes happen in the first place. But yes, theologically, of course, it goes back to sin.
And things don't operate perfectly anymore.
Exactly.
Things run down.
Exactly.
And so that's why we age and die, actually. The whole reason for death is because of sin. So you were going to show us there.
Here, Bodhi, I have a question for you. From your research, do you know where the Aboriginals came from?
Yeah, the Australian Aborigines. That's a great question. I'm glad somebody brought that one up. When I did the book, I actually did comment on the Aborigines. A lot of the Aborigines, they actually share the same language family, so we can kind of tie the group together. It's not like there was a whole bunch of different groups of Aborigines that made it down there. There had actually been some genetic research done that actually tied them into some of the Hindu Kush, as well as some of the people in Malaysia, the tribe of Seba, as well as some of the people in the lower parts of Africa. Now what's interesting is all those other people groups are descendants specifically of Kush, one of Noah's grandsons. The Hindu Kush, for example, you still see a reflection of the name. Seba, the tribe of Seba, specifically in Malaysia, is actually one of the sons of Kush. So I mean, we kind of see some genetic connections in there as well. So that's kind of a fascinating one as well.
I think I read years ago too that the Australian dingo was very similar to, I think, the Indian wolf or something like that, a dog that they recognized that came down from the north. So that would all fit with that too. Yeah. But Dr. Jeanson, you're going to show us this article. So this is a secular article, right?
This is the paper people point to when they say humans and chimpanzees are kissing cousins, essentially.
Okay.
2005, Nature, one of the big 3 journals in the globe. So this is the chimpanzee genome sequencing paper. I'm going to zoom down now to the section of the paper where they actually talk about where this 1% number comes from. So here on the section called genome evolution, nucleotide divergence, so difference basically. They aligned, so best reciprocal nucleotide level alignments of chimpanzee and human. They're aligning human and chimpanzee DNA. 2.4 billion gigabases, that's 2.4 billion letters of DNA, including the sex chromosomes, and here's where they say it. We calculate the genome-wide nucleotide divergence to be 1.23%. So, settled, isn't it? Well, what does this 2.4 gigabases, 2.4 billion represent? You just scroll up a little bit here. The assembly statistics, the total amount of DNA that they had from chimpanzee was 2.7. 2.7, 2.4, who cares? Well, 2.4 divided by 2.7 is 89% of the total sequence. So this 1.23%, see if I can get them both on the same screen, 1.23% difference comes from 2.4, which is only 89% of the total. In other words, we're 1.23% different in 89% of our sequence, and 11% is unaccounted for or unalignable. Why is that significant? Well, you have another website here. This is just an independent organization. They've done alignments of human and chimpanzee with a different algorithm. And they say, you scroll down here, genome coverage, how much of the chimpanzee genome is found in human? 89%. So 2 independent sources giving the same number. So my colleague Jeff Tompkins has done his own independent alignment of these, same number, 89%. 1% different, 11% difference, it still seems close. Well, let's put this now in terms of absolute number of letters. How many letters different is an 11% difference? It's about 300 to 400 million differences.
That's
so
massive.
this is a gigantic genetic gap between us and the chimpanzee. Furthermore, the evolutionists, this is a 2014 paper in Science, they've measured the rate at which chimpanzee mutates. We already knew there's been a whole bunch of studies on the rate at which humans mutate. Now we know chimpanzees. And it's not what they predicted. So for years, textbooks have been saying humans and chimpanzees split from the fossil record 4 to 6 million years ago. Well, based on the number of genetic differences, even if they say, well, let's just look at 1%. We know the rate at which humans mutate, which chimpanzees mutate. So the difference, 1% difference, human mutation, chimpanzee mutation. This now says they must have split 13 million years ago. So which is it? This is 100% off from what they said originally. So they're not making accurate predictions in genetics from their evolutionary ancestry model. So this model to me is not very successful, and the 1% difference is definitely not accurate. There's hundreds of millions of differences between us and chimpanzees.
And yet school kids are being taught that as fact, and many people out there have this erroneous view, how can the Bible be true? We're 1% different from chimps, which is not true.
Exactly. And in this book, we have probably half of that chapter, if I remember correctly, deals with all the issues that surround that question. We explain what I've just derived there. We talk about some of the human chromosome 2 fusion. There's all these other shared mistakes. There's all sorts of other evidences they like to invoke as evidence of common ancestry as inexplicable apart from common ancestry.
It just shows you the general public out there, students in schools and colleges, are just brainwashed. And they're not taught how to think critically about these things.
And I would say, again, we're seeing tables turn, like with what I said earlier about mitochondrial DNA, that old creationists don't make testable predictions. Actually, now I'm challenging my evolutionists to make testable predictions. And I'm saying, and if you're really confident in your ability to do it, let's go into the lab and do it and see who's right. Here you have a case, let's say with human chromosome 2 fusion, where they've made a prediction and it turns out to be the opposite. They've made a prediction here and it's wrong. What I was going to get at is the other thing we're often accused of is confirmation bias. Basically, cherry picking data. We start with a predetermined conclusion and then we just select those facts that fit what we've decided already is true and just discard everything else, explain away everything else. What are they going to do in this case? They've established 6 million years ago, here's this fact that doesn't fit it. You just revise it. There's a confirmation bias here.
They're the ones that are cherry picking. They're the ones that are really imposing their view on the evidence, and when it disagrees, they ignore the evidence, right?
I don't think they do it deliberately necessarily. I don't think they even realize the extent to which they're ignoring competing explanations. That's really, to me, what this debate comes down to.
Because they're so convinced of the millions of years.
Or I put it this way, I've had reporters ask me, they'll give me two options. They'll say, well, you're obviously disagreeing with 97% of professional scientists, which is what surveys show. 97% reject creation, accept evolution of some sort, whether God directed or not. So what is it? Is the science, should we throw all that science in the trash, or is there a grand conspiracy? I say neither of those. It's a really simple, boring explanation. Creation is forbidden in the public school system. Professional scientists get their education in the public school system. They go through all their education never having read a single creationist paper. Science is a method of inductive reasoning. Basically, it's you never prove anything, you just disprove the competition. To disprove something, you have to be aware that it exists. So if you go through your entire education, you're taught there's this hypothesis and varieties of it, and you're not even aware that there's this whole other realm that's making testable predictions, that's confirming explanations in genetics and mitochondrial DNA and nuclear and all these other areas. Well, of course you're never going to realize that you have this confirmation bias while you're doing it. You've never been taught otherwise. So what I tell reporters is it's really simple. They're not aware of the competition. They're forbidden from reading the competition. So of course all they land on is evolution.
They're really indoctrinated.
Yeah.
And they only think in one particular way.
Yeah.
Any other questions, Maria? Yeah.
Yeah, someone said, is it true that you can get all the different skin tones, the different races, from Noah's daughters-in-laws?
Yeah. Is it true we can get all the different skin tones, the so-called races? Of course, they're not races. We're all one race biologically, from those 3 women going back there. And the answer is yes. It's just genetic variability, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think what many people don't realize and what really clicks is, we've talked about mitochondrial DNA. This is really sort of the exception to the rule. It comes only through mom. Most of our DNA, so I said that's about 16,000, 17,000 letters, which compared to 3 billion is a tiny fraction. So where does this billion come from? Actually, it's 6 billion. 3 billion from mom, 3 billion from dad. So most of our features are determined from 2 sources. And so we can explain races really just using genetics 101. It goes back to Gregor Mendel in the late 1800s. He used pea plants. You have yellow-seeded pea plants, green-seeded pea plants. You cross them, all the offspring are yellow. So what happened to green? Was it destroyed? No, it's just hidden because yellow is dominant over green. You intercross these offspring, the next generation, you have green and yellow in predictable mathematical varieties. So the same thing really holds true with skin tone. You can, even if you broke it down into just 2 genetic varieties, you have 2 parents giving inputs. At the flood, you have 3 different couples giving inputs. So you have all sorts of variety, and we know that skin tone is controlled by more than just one particular DNA letter. There's a whole bunch of ones. So you have all these different combinations. 3 sets of parents all giving different inputs, and you can see it today. When a dark-skinned African marries a light-skinned Northern European, their children are middle brownish. They have blended features, and if those children would marry children of other sort of mixed ethnic group marriages, you'd see a whole spectrum. So it's very easy with simple genetics.
And it's basically one skin tone anyway.
Yeah.
Melanin is the main pigment, and it's basically a brown pigment. There's no truly, really black people, no truly white people. It's a matter of what shade you are, not what color you are. So yeah, see, I'm not white. If I was white, I'd look like that, and people would call 911 thinking I had a problem.
Exactly.
So it just comes down to the amount of variability, and that's where people also are easily led astray in regard to speciation, aren't they? Because you can see different species, and they think, wow, that's evolution. Wait a minute, that's just a tiny reflection of the variability that's already there in the dog genes or cat genes and that sort of thing, correct?
Yeah, and classically, we think of species as inability to interbreed. So horses and donkeys are labeled separate species because even though they can produce an offspring, which we have in our petting zoo over there, the zoo here at the Creation Museum, that offspring is sterile. So we'd say there's a reproductive barrier. Well, in humans, there's no reproductive barriers whatsoever. If brother and sister marry, they might not be able to reproduce, but an African can marry a Chinese can marry a Native American, any ethnic group can marry any other ethnic group and have children. So there's the human race is one species. There's no biological basis for saying there should be separate species or somehow there's these weird distinctions. No, these are just varieties that God, now we know from genetics, probably had in the start in Adam and Eve. Again, there's 2 parents both giving input, and you've got billions of letters. I mean, the mathematical possibilities are incredible. Yeah,
I read one paper where it talked about the number of atoms in the universe is 10 to the 80th power, 1 followed by 80 zeros, but the number of combinations one man and one woman could have just from their genetic variability is like 10 to the 2017th power.
Yeah.
Which is, you can't even think about it, that number's so big. And there's that sort of variability in the dog kind, the cat kind, the elephant kind, and the evolutionists see the result of that variability, and so it's evolution. It's got nothing to do with evolution.
Yes, and we can, so now that we have human sequences from thousands of people around the globe, on average, we're about 0.1% different from one another. So in our billions of letters, about 4 to 5 million, I think I have the number up here somewhere, maybe not on the wall, but about 4 to 5 billion letters, 45 million letters, so it's a tiny fraction of the billions, 4 to 5 million between me and an African, me and a Chinese, me and a Native American. In Adam and Eve, there were maybe 5 to 10 million, and again, so if there's 2 different versions of these 5 million, 10 million letters, 2 different versions at position 1, 2 different versions at position 500,000, 2 different versions at position 4,500,652. There's massive variety you can have, and it looks like now in the animal kinds, God probably put even more variety. And I can say this because we now have the tiger DNA sequence. We have the house cat DNA sequence, and there's 40 to 50 million differences between them.
And that would explain why you can get these different species in animals. You don't see it in humans because God put in there a greater variability.
Yes, it appears that there were more varieties in animals and plants, in non-humans basically, at the start, whereas humans had less. That's still, millions of differences is a huge number, and you can get a huge number of combinations from that. You can get even more from the animals that were there, which is why you can get 135 bovid species. You can get 37 or so cat species. You can get all this variety you can get hundreds of breeds. That's really what's remarkable. It's something Darwin pointed out too. There's more breeds than species.
And then that's why we have all this information for people in exhibits at the Ark to show that Noah only needed the kinds on the Ark, not the species, not all these breeds and so on, and was far fewer animals than what people realize. So genetics is fun for creationists, isn't it?
Yes, and one of my favorite examples is, let's say, the horse kind or the equid kind. Today you've got 7 living species. You've got 3 different species of zebras, which are distinguishable by their stripe patterns. You've got an an African wild ass that got stripes on its legs, which looks remarkably similar to that hybrid that we have out in the zoo at the Creation Museum between a donkey and a zebra. And then you've got 2 wild Asian ash species and a used to be wild horse species. So 7 species. The number of breeds, this is what I like to ask audiences when I'm speaking. How many breeds of horses and donkeys do you think there are? And they'll guess. Well, 50, 100. Over 850 breeds of horses, from Clydesdales to ponies. There's massive variety. And here's what's really the kicker for the evolutionists. We think about the origin of species, the question that's been the basis for this debate for 150 years. Darwin made an argument against the fixity of species using these sorts of data, saying, well, there's all these variety in breeds. Well, why are you saying that species are fixed? We can make we can make more variety in breeds than species. Well, now let's flip the argument around. When did these breeds originate? Forget even the creationist timescale. The evolutionists themselves say hundreds, thousands of breeds. There's thousands of cattle, sheep, and goat breeds, over 3,000. They say all of these arose within 12,000 years or less. So I'm just using their timescale for sake of argument. Then they turn around and say, there's 850 or more breeds of horses and donkeys in 12,000 years. Clydesdales to ponies. Then they turn around and say, but those 7 species, those took 4 million years or so. That can't possibly be true. If you can get this, hundreds of varieties in a few thousand years, well then surely these 7 couldn't have taken that long.
That's a really good point. Hey, Maria, any other questions? I know people could ask questions. This is fascinating. We could sit here all day. But Dr. Jeanson has to get back to work, and I'm actually going down the Ark, and I'm going to do a live broadcast from the Ark this afternoon at around 3 o'clock. But Maria, any other questions?
Someone asked, how is the data being validated?
How is the data being validated?
So the gold standard of science, I'll use a page from the evolutionary playbook. What's the gold standard of science? What's the difference between science and non-science? It's the ability to make testable predictions. You have a theory of gravity, you have a theory of physics. Well, let's test it to see if the space shuttle blows up. Now that's an extreme view. Normally you vet those data beforehand to make sure it's actually going to work and it's going to send a man to outer space and a man to the moon, that sort of thing. That's the gold standard of science, and that's why evolutionists have tried to use that as a club against creationists for decades. Well, how does that advance our understanding of the world? Well, we've just seen. I can predict for you. And let me back up. We've talked about mitochondrial DNA. It's a piece of DNA that helps us metabolize food. Well, thousands, millions of species around the globe metabolize food. They have to take energy from their environment and transform it. They all have mitochondrial DNA. Well, we know the mutation rates from only a handful, less than 10, maybe less than around 5. And I'm saying I can predict, for anyone who's interested, and I'm willing to test this in the lab, I can predict the mutation rate in dogs. I can predict the mutation rate in wolves. I can predict the rate of mitochondrial mutation rate in cats. In any other species on this planet, butterflies. Can the evolutionists do the same? That's the ultimate validation. I think that's the real challenge. So to put it in colloquial terms, they've said, well, you just say God did it. Here's what I think the evolutionists are going to come back to. Well, you're not considering natural selection. I'm going to say, oh, so you're saying natural selection did it. What does natural selection do to help us understand the world? What testable predictions does it make? That's really my challenge to the evolutionist. I think the tables have been completely turned. We have a set of retrodictions. That's what I'm going to call them. We've got the data now, and we can make sense of the past. Well, I can make sense of the future now too. Can evolutionists meet their own standard they've set for us? And not just on some tangential question, on the most important question from their perspective in the biological world, the rate at which mutations happen, the central mechanism of evolution. That's the way to validate it. That's something I'm actively trying to collaborate with some people now on, in going out and doing this now and measuring the mutation rate in mice or in some domestic animal. I think we can do this, and this is a way to validate everything I've just discussed.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
I know there's people asking questions, and we could be here all day, so we'll have to close soon, but let's see what else we got here.
Someone asked, has the Genome Project helped with any of this research?
The Human Genome Project.
Yes, this has been a massive help because let's put it in big picture terms. I'm going to back it up to the origin of species and then bring it back to humans, an example of one of the species. What are species? They're defined by their traits. Zebras by their stripes, their particular pattern of stripes, elephant by its trunk, giraffe by its long neck. Well, those traits are consistent from generation to generation. Put it this way, if a giraffe could birth an elephant birthed something else, we wouldn't even have a concept of species. The fact that species exists is a testament to the fact that it's a fundamentally genetic entity. The only direct scientific record of ancestry is genetics. Well, what's the history of genetics? Gregor Mendel, the start of most genetics textbooks, published his work 1865, 1866, 6 years after Darwin published his first work. We didn't know that DNA was the substance of heredity until 1953, nearly 100 years after Darwin. We didn't have the sequence of our own species in 2001. Basically, we've been arguing about side data, indirect data, for 150 years. Darwin took a massive risk when he tried to answer a fundamentally genetic question 150 years before he had any direct data with which to answer it. So, what has the human genome done for us? Well, this is finally now the first direct scientific record of our ancestry. And when we look at mitochondrial DNA, it fits the young Earth timescale. It fits the structure of the human population genetics at the flood. We look at our billions of letters, and we now have sequences from a couple thousand people around the globe in those billions of letters. It fits God creating differences in Adam and Eve. Well, isn't that arbitrary? No, it makes testable predictions, and I've published these, about the rate at which other things should change, and it fits exactly what we see. We didn't even have time to discuss this. So the Human Genome Project has been a huge help, a huge aid, a huge confirmation of what the biblical record says, and the success we've had in the human realm, the best studied species at the genetic level, has then allowed me to then extrapolate to other species and answer the bigger origin of species question that Darwin did and say, here's really the answer. And I'm working on a book that should be out this fall, running titles after Darwin, 3 quiet developments that rewrite the origin of every species, to discuss some of this. So it's really the success in humans that's laid the foundation for going to other species and saying we've completely turned the tables, and this is really now the superior model. It's making sense. It's making testable prediction. It's the evolutionists now are going to have to play defense. We're going on offense and taking the argument to them rather than the other way around.
And you know,
So I'm here with Nathaniel Jeanson, PhD. He's a research biologist. So Mr. Jeanson, talk to us about how biology supports creation.
Let me back up even further and say, how does biology deal with evolution? Because there's something many people don't realize. When Darwin wrote his book, he took a gigantic scientific risk. On the origin of species is fundamentally a genetic question. You see traits that define species, the zebra stripes, the giraffe's neck, elephant's trunk. Well, elephants produce long-trunked creatures, giraffes produce long-necked creatures. Something is inherited that defines what the species is. So to ask what's the origin of species is to ask a question of inheritance, which means that you're asking a fundamentally genetic question. Well, we didn't know that DNA was the physical basis for inheritance until 1953, to make a long story short. And once we discovered that, then it took another several decades to get DNA sequences from species around the planet, the estimated 2 million or more species that exist. We still don't have all the DNA sequences. So we really haven't been able to directly, scientifically evaluate Darwin's answer until now. So it's a really exciting time to be revisiting basically the origin of species, to get the direct data and not argue about this indirect stuff for which there are multiple explanations, and to ask, well, from whom do species come? How are they related? Where are they not related? When did they originate? How did they originate? Is it selection, natural selection? Is it something different? Where did they originate? Of course, in Darwin's day, people thought that God created species, in their current locations. Of course, if you read the Bible carefully, Genesis 1 to 11, it's obvious that the whole world was flooded and that they restarted on Ararat and must have migrated to their current location. So Darwin's arguments for migration we would endorse, by and large, because Scripture says they started in Ararat and migrated out to their current locations. So a lot of the research I'm doing these days, and that's really most of my task day to day, is answering those big questions. From whom do they originate? How do they originate? When and where? And also a lot of specific application on the human species in general. What about Noah, his wife, his sons and their wives? Is there a genetic signature of a population bottleneck, a reduction from a lot of people to 8 and then a restart? And some of the research I'm doing right now, and even that's running over the weekend, is looking at the different ethnic groups around the globe and one particular subset of DNA sequence that has strong implications that goes back to just the three wives of Noah's sons. So that's sort of a big picture on what I'm doing day to day.
Wow, that's very interesting. One thing that I've noticed on the ark is that technically, generally we hear people talk about Noah couldn't have put all those species on the ark. But the Bible doesn't say species, it says kinds. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, the key word, of course, the Old Testament written in Hebrew. The key word then is what's the Hebrew word that we translate species or kind or that sort of thing. It's the word mean, so it's not species per se. And if you look at the flood account in particular, God says bring male and female. So there's an implication that if two individuals, two species can breed, they're part of the same kind, and breeding studies have demonstrated that even though one of the 8 or so definitions for species has to do with reproduction, there are species today that are still reproductively compatible. Like a lion and a tiger can produce offspring. A horse and a zebra, a horse and a donkey and a zebra can produce offspring. So not species, but probably not even genus, but maybe a level of family. If you think about the traditional classification categories, all horses, donkeys, zebra species, 7 living today, would belong to the same family. All cats, large and small, from the house cat to the lion, belong to the same family. So Noah appears to have taken 2 felids, 2 members as a general rule, of each family on board the ark. And since today we see lots of species in each family, new species must have formed in the few thousand years since the flood. And we'd also say one family cannot be changed into another. After all, if they could, there's no point in having an ark. If you could just, have a few whales survive and then they evolve back onto the land, there's no point saving anything on the ship. So the fact that there needed to be an ark shows by itself that one kind of creature cannot change into another kind of creature.
That would be macroevolution. We do see microevolution, small changes. Can you talk about that?
So one of the key questions we're trying to answer right now in understanding the origin of species, and one that Darwin had no access to because of the entire community's ignorance of genetics, is what is the origin of the genetic information behind traits? And one of the most important elements of this is the fact that so many species, like humans, have biparental inheritance. We have a mother and a father. It's not asexual like bacteria, it's sexual reproduction. So that means both parents contribute something to the offspring genetically. And in humans, as an example, it's not that dad contributes one arm, let's say, and mom the other arm. Dad contributes the complete set of information. Mom contributes a complete set. And so there's varieties that you can kind of mix and match and choose from to produce the final outcome. And so the research I've been doing and just published 2 months ago made some arguments to say, even though the original kinds had no physical parents because they were created, there's good evidence to say that God created them genetically diverse from the start. So I have 2 copies of DNA that are different because my parents are different. In the beginning, I think we can argue that those kinds had 2 different copies of DNA within themselves. Once you have that, all the basic evolutionary biology people have established, population genetics, and these sorts of fields over the years say you can very quickly, in a single generation, produce all sorts of variety. You go back to where most modern genetic textbooks start, 1865, Gregor Mendel, he crosses pea plants. Let's say green seeded with yellow seeded, you cross them, yellow is dominant, all the offspring of yellow seeds. Well, if you intercross those, it's not that green was destroyed. Green reappears, and yellow in the next generation. So I'm saying that state is basically what God created the creatures like. They will look like one thing, but just a few crosses, boom, and you got all sorts of variety. You can do it in a single generation.
So Noah didn't need hundreds of dogs, he only needed 2.
2 dogs, and in fact I would say 2 canids. So the dog family has everything from wolves to coyotes to foxes and so forth, and he could easily produce the 36 or 37 species, whatever the number is today, in a short amount of time.
What about dinosaurs?
Noah would have taken those on board the ark as well. There's some question about how many dinosaur kinds there are, but what we just discussed applies equally well there. Not 2 of every species of dinosaur, but 2 of each kind of dinosaur. Again, it's a little bit harder to establish ancestry in the absence of genetics. Kind of hard to do genetics on dead things sitting on the ground, despite scientists' best efforts and claims otherwise. And so 2 of every kind, and again, we put on display the biggest ones because those capture my imagination and everyone else's imagination. They're just so huge. But Noah likely would not have taken those for a number of reasons, not just so he can try to cram them in, but the purpose of bringing them on board the ark, the explicit purpose in Genesis 7, is to preserve their seed. Unfortunately, I think the New King James says species there, but the word is the same thing you see later on in Genesis 12 to Abraham and his seed. It's clearly meaning offspring. It's sort of a recreation event. Instead of speaking things into existence from nothing, God saves them on the ark and says restart. There's a similar be fruitful and multiply there as you have in Genesis 1. And so which creatures are going to be most reproductively healthy or be able to reproduce the most and repopulate the earth after the flood? Well, the juveniles or the young adults, not the grandfathers. And so dinosaurs are reptiles, and reptiles just keep growing. What we put on display in museums are probably the grandparents or the great-grandparents, and those are not representative of the juveniles, the most reproductively fertile that Noah likely would have taken on board the ark.
So dinosaurs really then are just lizards or reptiles, not lizards, but reptiles that have lived for a long time.
The big ones are ones that have lived for a long time, and the reason we don't see them today is probably the same reason we don't see 70% of mammal families that we don't see today. Dinosaurs get the press because they fascinate the imagination, but the vast majority of mammal families no longer exist today. And so that's some of the things people will see on the board of the ark here is some of the extinct kinds that Noah would have seen but have since died out.
So what about the law of biogenesis? Doesn't it say something like life cannot come from non-life?
All we see is life coming from non-life. We've never seen life spontaneously arise. Scientists have made progress in synthesizing parts of life in the lab. It wouldn't surprise me if they do, because what have we been saying all along? That it requires superintelligence to create life, and if you see superintelligent people create life, well, that proves the point.
So that really just proves that it took intelligence to create life in the first place.
Exactly.
It makes sense. So where can our readers learn more about biology and how it supports creation?
You can go to the Answers in Genesis website. The sort of the first level you'll see at the Ark Encounter site, let's say the unbelievers, and really a lot of the exhibits that we've done here have been designed because we anticipate a lot of unbelievers coming through to meet them where they're at. So not assuming, let's say, necessarily a Bible background and Christianese and that sort of thing. We put the facts as they are, but not assuming that, oh, you've read Genesis, or oh, you know that backwards and forward Genesis 1 to 11. We're going to tell you the key foundational points and the scientific evidence that flows from it. So Ark Encounter would be sort of your entry point. Answers in Genesis has, I don't know how many articles, and we're continually updating our research. I'm doing a series that's going on right now, like an 11-part series on the origin of species after the flood. In fact, this past weekend's article, it comes up on Saturdays typically, was Did Darwin argue for the recent origin of species? And I think you can make an argument from his first 2 chapters, using his analogies, that species must have originated recently, not millions of years ago.
Maybe last question, unless another comes to mind. Some say that since there are no transitional forms, that maybe evolution happens spontaneously, that an animal, for example, an alligator or a lizard, laid an egg and a bird came out. Talk about that.
The hopeful monster idea, I'd say it's probably been rejected by the majority of the scientific community. Ever since Darwin, they've basically been gradualists. They would say we can find creatures that blend the features of 2 different species, which, from my perspective, the definition of transitional form has been massaged a little bit. When you think about it, what creatures blend the features of 2 different creatures? The platypus blends all sorts of features. And furthermore, let's say we find a bona fide transitional form, something that's like half amphibian, half fish, that they would predict to find if fish did evolve into land creatures. Well, you look at what humans design, and since we're made in the image of God, I think that gives us a sense, maybe a taste for the principles God might have used in Genesis chapter 1. Humans design transitional forms by that definition. Military engineers design ships for the water, they design tanks for the land, and if they want to go between those 2, they design amphibious assault vehicles that blend the features of 2 very different structures. They are not as good as tanks on the land, they're not as good as boats and ships in the ocean, but they are perfect and well adapted, well suited to that transitional environment and exceed both of those in their ability to go back and forth. So even if there was a whole list of transitional forms, this is what humans design. How much more so would God design creatures that blend features for transitional environments?
Makes sense. So if there are transitional forms, it doesn't prove evolution anyway.
It's ambiguous with respect to the origins question. Science is an inductive method of reasoning. You don't start with the premise and deduce. You start with observations and try to infer principles, which means you have to eliminate competing explanations. And so if you've got an observation that does not distinguish, it does not eliminate creation or evolution, it's irrelevant to the debate.
So in other words, you don't come to the problem with your worldview already in place. You let the evidence tell you what to believe.
Yeah, and because it's inductive, you're always going to be bringing some idea to it, and because humans are finite, there's always a chance you've missed something, which is why we have a system of peer review, and you try to get as many minds to bear on the question. Or give an example from graduate school. I used to think the biggest challenge to getting ideas published and such was my peers. No, or maybe my competitors. No, they're actually your scientific enemies, so to speak, or your greatest allies. And your real greatest enemy is actually the data. You can have the best hypothesis in the world and it might be wrong. And the only way you're going to know it's wrong is if someone can say, look, this test refutes your idea. And there's a good chance I've missed it because I can only think of so many things at once, and having multiple people say, oh, well, have you thought about this? Have you thought about this? That's what helps narrow down what hypotheses still stand, which ones have been rejected, and that's the biggest hurdle in the creation-evolution debate. The evolutionists tend to reject and not even consider or solicit the input of creationists who have a lot to bring to bear on the question, and could really help advance the debate by leaps and bounds.
So an honest look at the data really would support creation and reject evolution.
Yes, especially I'd say in my field of genetics that we've been doing, there's I think some really new, strong challenges. And the article that will be coming out this Saturday, we'll talk about some of those, not only on the question of ancestry, but the question of time. There's a genetic clock that ticks in species that points towards a recent origin, not a millions of years origin.
So RNA is sort of an intermediary. And it's a really interesting historical story. You go back to the early 1900s, people took Mendel's principles, just mathematical ratios about what percentage of your offspring are going to have red hair or some other trait. What percentage are male and female? Is it 50-50? That sort of thing. And they connected that to these chromosome structures. Chromosomes have protein and DNA. Well, even before DNA was the substance of heredity, there were biochemical experiments that said, hey, there's something going on with proteins that matches what Mendel said. There's a protein genetic link here. So we know proteins have something to do with how we look. Then you get to Watson-Crick, 1953, structure of DNA. So we've established protein plays a role in heredity. Now we know DNA does. What's the relationship between the two? And it took, I think, around a decade of much trial and error, theorizing. There was a hypothesis that maybe proteins physically interacted with that twisted ladder-like structure. There were questions of, well, how many rungs of that DNA ladder code for one subunit of a protein? All these things were open questions. And finally, somewhat serendipitously and a lot of sweat and effort and money, they discovered that there was an intermediary. So RNA is like one half of this ladder of DNA. It's chemically very similar, ribonucleic acid. There's really basically an oxygen link there that's missing in DNA, deoxy, ribonucleic acid. And RNA is, so the way it works then, how do you code for traits? Well, you have DNA, there's information there, coded in some way. Well, the cell has machinery that goes and recognizes certain rungs, starts making a copy of that DNA, makes an RNA copy, and we call it transcription because it is like transcribing. So I'm speaking words orally, and if you write it down, you're transcribing what I'm saying. It's really the same thing, making a copy. This is then taken to another part of the cell, to the ribosome, where it's translated. That's the technical term, because it goes from a DNA RNA type language, chemical language, to an amino acid, a totally different chemistry, that protein language. And then it's usually the proteins that do the business of the cell, that break down our food, that transform chemicals to give us skin tone and gives the zebra its stripes and so forth. So it's this intermediary that they finally discovered, and there's a whole code to that too. And there's 3 rungs basically of the RNA ladder, if I can speak that way, that code for a subunit of a protein, and that was all discovered fairly recently as well.
Well, I'm very pleased to have Nathaniel Jeanson join me this morning for this interview. And thank you, Nathaniel. And
thank you.
So go ahead and tell us, what is your background, your education, and how you got started in this ministry?
Did my undergraduate in Wisconsin, originally from Racine, born in Milwaukee. It's a dairy state, cheeseheads, Fairweather Packer fan.
Yeah.
Did my undergraduate in molecular biology and bioinformatics at the University of Wisconsin Parkside. Did 3 years of research there on molecular biology of photosynthesis, basically using single-celled algae. Got interested in cancer, so then I did my PhD at Harvard in cell and developmental biology, and then joined ICR in 2009 as soon as I graduated, and am currently the Deputy Director for Life Sciences Research.
I have, from the book Evolution Shot Full of Holes, authored by myself and Frank Sherwin, a quote from Charles Darwin, famous quote, kind of help us get started. So Charles Darwin wrote in his book On the Origin of Species, "If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not have possibly been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, then my theory would absolutely break down." So as you observe biology or microbiology, can you provide any example or maybe a couple of examples that where if Darwin were alive today, where we could show him through observable science that his theory does indeed break down.
We could show him numerous examples. Whether or not he'd be persuaded is another question. But perhaps start at the very basics. For evolution to get going, it has to evolve the first cell, the first self-replicating molecule, basically DNA, RNA, protein. Even if you start with RNA, life is, by and large, the vast majority of life functions based on a DNA system. So DNA is transcribed or sort of written down, if we use a writing analogy, transcribed into RNA. So if you were to write down what I was saying right now, you'd be transcribing it. And if you were to plug it into your computer and Google Translate and translate it into German, that's analogous for RNA to protein. And all three of these components are interdependent. You really can't read the DNA without the RNA, at least the cell can't. And even if you got just DNA and RNA, proteins involved in reading the DNA, they're all interdependent. You remove one component from the system, it basically breaks down. Okay,
you have repeated that word. I wanted to emphasize it. It's completely different than independent. They are interdependent. In order to achieve its operational ability, it has to all be working at the same time.
That's right. And Mike Behe coined the term irreducible complexity to describe this phenomenon. It's sort of the trade secret of the evolutionary community. For a number of reasons, there have been a number of responses to this. It's generated a lot of controversy, not surprisingly. And really four major responses have appeared, none of which really address the question. So Darwin, of course, appealed to what he called artificial selection as a justification for the validity of natural selection to explain all that we see. But really it's kind of a cheating analogy and doesn't address the test he laid out, because what is artificial selection? It's intelligent human beings picking and choosing the varieties they want. And in evolution, there is no intelligence. So it's an interesting analogy, but it doesn't get at the question of how could natural processes without intelligence overcome this interdependence hurdle. It doesn't address that. How do people respond to these obvious problems with evolution? Basically, they ignore it and then say, well, we can really overcome it and sort of switch the topic. Darwin would switch the topic and say, well, look at artificial selection, look what it can do. So just doesn't seem like a big logical step to assume that natural processes could do the same thing. But it is a huge logical step. How could natural selection substitute for human intelligence? It's really difficult to imagine. Obviously, some species survive, some don't, but how does that overcome the hurdles that intelligence normally overcomes to make interdependent systems like DNA, RNA, and protein? Some might appeal to hierarchies, and leaving that analogy, maybe it seems, I don't know the biology necessarily of birds and dinosaurs in great depth, but there's obviously huge physiological differences, and if we examine the molecular biology of it, we might find very quickly an example of something that's impossible to evolve by this mechanism Darwin proposed. And so what evolutionists will often do then is avoid the details and just say, well, we see a progress from simple to complex, let's say in the fossil record. Okay. Simple dinosaurs and complex birds, and we see these intermediates. None of that really addresses the question, because Darwin said details are what matters. So it's not whether we can see simple to complex, it's can that simple organism be transformed step by tiny step into something more complex. So that avoids the question as well. Another thing they come up with, and I've heard this because I've given public lectures and groups of atheists and skeptics have come out and tried to protest and ask pointed questions, and I've raised this argument. And one of them said, well, couldn't there have been a scaffold, a molecular scaffold, or maybe even a mineral scaffold that kept this part of the equation going, maybe kept DNA working without these other components while these were still evolving, or maybe we kept this aspect of reptilian physiology going while we're waiting, in a sense, for the bird features to evolve. And that's a novel hypothesis without a shred of evidence. And again, it's really a bad analogy. Who creates scaffold? So what is a scaffold? It's something you erect as you're building something. It's not part of the final structure. It supports the work on that structure. And you remove it when you're done. You never see a trace of it. Well, again, who does it? It's intelligent human engineers. We have no example of that really in nature. We do have proteins that are involved in multiple processes in the cell that aren't part of the final structure, but that's just bumping the question back. We really need to. Really, it's an appeal to total speculation, because what would be the evidence of a scaffold? You wouldn't see any, because it's there during the process, then disappears. So it's really hand waving when someone says, well, maybe a molecular scaffold could overcome Darwin's. None of the appeals they've made to try to refute and deal with this example, when they actually try to deal with it, solve the problem. So Darwin's test that he laid out 150 years ago is as valid today as it was back then, and in fact because of the revolution of molecular biology and cell
It's far
biology,
more valid.
we've discovered numerous examples of where this applies, and really, that's where the answer will be. Where does change happen? It's at the DNA level. And so if you're going to find an irreducibly complex system, it's going to be in the DNA, and we've seen multiple examples of this already.
Perfect. And I'd love to expand on that just a little bit. Let's talk about DNA some more. Help people understand what DNA is, and imagine what would need to take place for, in a world where there is no life, there is no DNA, but through evolutionary, or it can't even be evolutionary actually, it's just by chance and chemicals, I guess, that you get these 4 nucleotides that come together to form their own language, to form their own communication system. What would, just describe that? To me, that just seems just so mind-boggling that, again, it very much fulfills Darwin's statement. Formed by numerous successive slight modifications. What would be the mechanism for these things to come together? Go ahead.
So here we're dealing with a really unique problem in evolution, abiogenesis, or life from non-life. And some evolutionists have pointed out, well, we can't really apply the test here per se because this assumes some sort of self-replication and this hasn't yet evolved. But nevertheless, Darwin laid out the test, and so we're just taking him at his word. What's even more complicated here is we got complex chemistry at play. So DNA is really just the stuff of inheritance. What gives us our eye color, hair color, height, so forth. It's what mom and dad pass on through egg and sperm, and really those contain DNA, and that's what makes you anatomically and physiologically who you are. So how do we get this code evolved in the first place? So it controls not only our own anatomy and physiology, it controls trees. It's really the basis for nearly every life form out there. So how do we get this evolved in the first place? DNA has very special chemistry. It has sort of a handedness. You can't superimpose your left and right hand. They're mirror images of each other. And we have that sort of handedness, it's chirality, chemical term, in life. And there's really only one chiral form in the life forms that we see, the vast majority of them. But natural processes don't have a selective production of one hand or the other. Natural processes produce 50-50 mixtures, and if you produce 50-50 mixtures, you're not going to evolve the life that we see today. So there's one problem. Of course, the chemical additions are a difficult problem. How do we get them to meet up in just the right order? And it's not just an order problem, it is
or even to find themselves, or in a whole mass of other organic chemicals.
Exactly. And even if you could solve all these difficult chemical problems, which we've just scratched the surface, you then have the problem, how do you start reproducing itself? Even if you just, through some completely random chance process, happened upon, you struck gold in the lottery, how are you going to get that thing to start reproducing itself and get evolution going? Again, you have protein components, RNA components, you have all these other molecular structures that are involved in replication of DNA. So you've only taken one tiny step forward, and we're close to getting evolution going.
One of the things I like to talk to the students about when we interact with them near the campus in Madison is just the whole dilemma of making proteins. That it requires a whole plethora of proteins in order to create a protein. So where could the first protein have come from without the existence of all these other proteins that are needed for the transcription factors, the polymerase, it's just mind-boggling to think that anybody who is that intelligent, that's in terms of biology and chemistry, that they must understand this, but it's just completely illogical.
It is a real chicken and egg problem, which evolutionists have tacitly admitted, which is what has led to this in vogue idea of the RNA world. There are some RNAs that can act as enzymes and multitask in a sense, but that really doesn't solve the problem because, again, life, by and large, is based on DNA is transcribed to RNA, made to protein. And of course, there are exceptions to this rule, but this is the fundamental, the central dogma is what it's called in biology. And even if you had some sort of multitasking molecule in the beginning, it's got to then transition to this interdependent system that has many of the components you mentioned, and that seems virtually impossible based on the standard that Darwin set. Of course, you could have some sort of miracle. Here's one more exception that Darwinists have come up with to try to get around Darwin's problem. They'll talk about neutral evolution. So here's evolution apart from natural selection. Well, really, it's just a chance process. So here's where we apply probability calculations. Simple probability calculations to the origin of the first DNA molecule, the first protein molecule, are just astronomical, beyond even the Big Bang estimate of the origin of the universe. I wouldn't agree with that date, but more than the atoms in the universe. It's just a mind-boggling probability. It's impossible by any reasonable standard. So they really have no explanation, which is why I think people like Richard Dawkins have come out non-public and said they think the first life was seeded here by aliens. It's just that hard to do, and so if we can push the problem off to another planet, maybe we won't have to think about it quite as much. It really doesn't solve the problem because you just apply all those same problems to that other planet. How did it get going there in the first place? And no one really has an answer to that.
But I would just like to say, from a non-scientific point of view, from that, I think that there's maybe it's a misnomer that people will say, well, as long as there's a chance, you know, even no matter what the statistical data is and how many zeros there are behind the 10, as long as there's a chance it could have happened, or maybe there was a miracle. But from my point of view as a non-scientist, I look at the way some of these things would have had to take place or would have had to been formed, whether it's the letters that didn't exist before that had to come together to create a code that didn't exist before without any intelligence guiding it, without any duplication or replication to create any kind of chance or error, you know, and correction. None of that. That's only just the beginning, whether it's the RNA world or DNA or the first protein and all the things that would need to take place for a first protein to come about. It's just these machines that must happen. It cannot happen. We're talking about, from my point of view, you can't say it, I will. It's impossible. It is impossible. There is no possibility for this to happen.
And analogies may help. I read about one that was, I think, very insightful. There is a chance that all the oxygen atoms in this room can collect in a corner and we'd asphyxiate. But no one goes to bed at night wondering if they're going to be dead the next morning because all the oxygen atoms collect in the room. There is a chance that a flat football will inflate itself through collisions of molecules in the air. But none of the NFL referees stand around waiting for the footballs to inflate themselves. It's just, it really exposes the hypocrisy. Again, we take for granted these basically impossible scenarios that have a chance of happening. But when it comes to something like evolution, all that intuition is cast aside, and people cling to, that's a chance, there is a chance, when they disregard that sort of thinking in every other aspect of life. And it's really totally inconsistent.
Nathaniel, it has been a pleasure.
Thank you
you so much for going through this and explaining these details regarding origins, regarding biology and microbiology and what goes on inside the cell. I very, very much appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Social Church. We've got a really good question today. There are 8.7 million different species of animals and insects on the earth today. The question is, how on earth did they all fit on the ark? Who better to ask than the expert on Genesis, Nathaniel Jeanson. Thank you so much for your time, Nathaniel. I know you're a busy man. So, how did all of these species, 8.7 million animals, birds and insects, fit on the ark?
This is a great question. That's really the second half of a common skeptical derision of the scriptural account. So the first half of the skeptic's typical question is, Noah's Ark can't possibly be true because you can't possibly fit the 1.6 million species that exist today on board the Ark.
Yeah, sure.
And of course the answer to that is Noah didn't have to fit all the 1.6 million species on board the Ark. Number one, because he's not putting whales on the Ark. It's a flood after all.
Yeah.
And number two, he's not going to fit likely not going to fit all the arthropods, spiders, insects, so forth. He's just bringing the land-dependent, air-breathing creatures on board the Ark, which is basically mammals, reptiles, amphibians, birds.
Yeah.
And the scripture doesn't even speak of species. Some English Bibles unfortunately use that term, but species is really a modern invention thanks to Carl Linnaeus in the 1700s.
Okay.
The Hebrew Bible speaks of kinds. That's typically the English word we use to translate the Hebrew word mean. So God creates creatures in Genesis chapter 1 according to their mean, and Noah's commanded to take creatures on board the ark according to their mean, their kinds. And if you look at what kinds are, Noah's commanded to take the male and female of each kind for the purpose of preserving their seed, their offspring. That implies then that if we can interbreed certain individuals, even if they're separate species, they're probably part of the same kind. And applying that criterion to the animal world, there's a general rule that has emerged. There are species that can still produce live offspring today. As a general rule, the kind is not a species. The kind is not even a genus. That's the next level up of classification. So, for example, the red fox and the Arctic fox not only are separate species, they each are placed in their own genus. That's not the level of kind either. Rather, the family level. So using the fox example, foxes, coyotes, wolves, dogs, dingoes all belong to the same family. The family is Canidae. And it's the family level of classification that's likely the best approximation for what the biblical kind is. So if you then ask the question, well, how many kinds, how many families did Noah have to bring on board the ark, living and extinct, you only come up with about less than 2,000. So the ark has plenty of room for these creatures.
Wow, okay.
Then, of course, that raises the question, you got families on board the ark, let's see, but there's now 30 plus species, hundreds of breeds of dogs within the dog family. That means you have a whole bunch of breeds and species from that pair on board the ark in, just a few thousand years? That's impossible. That's more evolution than Darwin proposed. That's sometimes how they'll state their argument against the scripture. So what's the answer to that? One of the answers stems from something Darwin himself said. So one of his arguments for evolution that's sort of been lost in the modern discussion comes from the opening chapters of his book on the origin of species. In 1859, he was trying to argue against an archaic, outdated, unbiblical view of the origin of species. The older view back then was that God created species, not kinds, which is not biblically justified. So he was just trying to find a way to argue against species being fixed and unchanging. And one of the things the arguments he gave in 1859 was a comparison. He said, let's compare the amount of variety that we see in the wild compared to the variety that we see on farms, on ranches. So we can use a modern version of this. If you look at the horse, donkey, zebra family, there's 3 species of zebras in existence today, 1 species of wild horse, the Przewalski's horse, wild asses, 2 in Asia, 1 in Africa. 7 species total. There's over 850 breeds of horses and donkeys in existence today. So Darwin said, and challenged his contemporary creationists who thought that God created species, he said, okay, let's think about this logically. Where do all the breeds come from? And so today we could say, where do the 700 plus breeds of horses come from? Well, there's only one answer we can give, because we humans were responsible for producing them. We'll take, let's say, a long-haired black coat color horse and mate it with a short-haired red coat color horse to try to produce a long-haired red colored coat colored horse, that sort of thing. That's what we've been doing for however long, hundreds of years, millennia, to produce the breeds we want. The answer to Darwin's rhetorical question is, well, of course, all these 700 breeds come from a common ancestor, because we humans were the ones doing this. So then Darwin, once he's established that in the minds of his readers, okay, breeds have a common ancestor, he turns around and says, okay, why would you say species do not have common ancestors? So if the greater amount of variety, and if you look at the amount of variety that exists in breeds, it's stupendous. All that variety comes from a common ancestor. Why wouldn't you turn around and say this lesser amount of variety, zebras, horses, donkeys in the wild, why would you say those don't have a common ancestor? And that's a pretty good argument. It has its limits, because you can't really tie rhinos or tapirs into this equation. They're the closest living relatives, according to evolutionists, of the horses and such. All the amount of variety in horse breeds doesn't bridge the gap between horses and rhinos. It's a good argument, nonetheless, that really fits, I think, this idea of biblical kinds. So the question, though, is the question of time. How could you get 7 species of horses from a pair, or 7 species of horses, donkeys, zebras, from a pair of equids on board the ark in just a few thousand years? And this is where we can take Darwin's argument to its logical conclusion. He didn't discuss the question of time. He just assumed millions of years in his arguments. And let's do it now then. Let's take it to its logical conclusion. So I'm going to make an argument within the evolutionary framework, use the evolutionists' own statements against them to show that we can very easily get breeds and species in just a few thousand years. So if you ask the evolutionists today about those 7 living equid species, 3 zebras, 3 asses, one horse, you say, well, how long did it take, evolutionarily speaking, for these species to arise? And the literature will tell you about 4 million years. 4 million years for 7 species. So, of course, they say that's ridiculous to say these 7 species happen in just a few thousand. And this is where I'd stop them and say, hold on. Tell me, evolutionists, tell me how long it took for the 700 breeds of horses to arise. So you think, for many, you do the math, you say, okay, 7 species in the wild, 700 breeds, that's a 100-fold difference. 4 million years for the wilds, well, maybe it'd take 400 million years for the breeds. And that's not the answer you'll find in the literature. The evolutionists themselves say these 700-plus breeds arose not over 400 million years, but over just 12,000. So think of that. There's 700 breeds in just a few thousand years. 7 species in 4 million years. Those numbers don't make any sense. Using Darwin's own logic, you basically have to say, even within an evolutionary framework, if 700 breeds can arise in a few thousand years, then surely 7 species can.
Wow.
So from Darwin's own pen, we can make an argument showing the plausibility of species in a few thousand years. Of course, I don't accept the 12,000 year time scale. That was just to show that the evolutionists can't even make a consistent argument against the young Earth model. I'd say it goes down to a few thousand years, 4,500 or so. But looking at what's been done on the farm immediately makes all the more plausible what we've seen in the wild. So that's one of many arguments we could make showing that this is quite plausible. And actually, genetically, it goes back to this idea of big A, big B, little b. If animals, these kinds, were created genetically homogeneous, with no variety in their DNA, all capital letters or all lowercase letters, then yeah, it's pretty hard to create species, to make species in a few thousand years. However, if God creates these kinds with capital A, lowercase a, capital B, lowercase b, and you do that for the millions of DNA positions that exist, you're going to exhaust all the letters of the English alphabet and more. That means they have the potential to produce all sorts of variety in a single generation. We now have multiple lines of evidence indicating that this was indeed the case. This is how God created the kinds in the beginning. So they had the potential within themselves to form all sorts of species in sort of an evolutionary heartbeat. And the reason the evolutionists have not come to this conclusion is because they reject from the outset this idea that there could have been front-loaded genetic variety. They say, nope, everything must be the result of genetic mistakes. This precludes them from even considering the possibility that there were front-loaded genetic information, front-loaded genetic variety at the start. And so they've missed this incredible explanation for how so many species can arise in just a few thousand years. But we can see the echo of it in the breeds that have formed. those are formed not by and large, not by farmers going in and mutating the DNA of horses. They're just taking what exists, the variety that already exists in their genetics, and just reshuffling it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. That's absolutely brilliant. Really good stuff.